All right, there you go.
Okay, so. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to anyone who's still around after about half an hour of glitches. We may be ready to start rolling with our third live stream in this new series. My apologies for the technical problems both this week and last week. So I hope there's a few people left hanging around, and maybe some others will come back as we proceed. Now, I need to make an announcement with regard to next week's live streams. We're not planning to have one next week because of some other urgent business that has come up here locally. However, the following week, that is the weekend of December the 18th and the 19th, depending on which part of the world you're living in, that will have the theme of Christmas, pros and cons, thoughts about Christmas from whatever perspective you want to take. So look forward to that one, and we will be sharing at that time a little bit about a special project we've been doing here in Australia and for the past 10 days, and we'll continue to do up until Christmas Day itself. We'll tell you a little bit about that. Kind of exciting. All right, the theme today is divorce and remarriage. And before I begin with any of the questions, I want to talk about one word that I know is going to come up over and over as we go through these issues. That word is exception. Now, exceptions by definition are exceptional, meaning they're rare. But the problem comes in when everyone wants to claim that they're the exception. Okay, and so we get a lot of so-called exceptions that are just not exceptions at all. And so we'll be looking into that a little bit as we go through these. There are exceptional situations that people sometimes describe, which are totally unreliable for setting the rules. A bit like, the abortion people carrying on about some 12-year-old girl that gets raped and her health is bad and she's going to die, and somebody says she can't get an abortion, as though that's what abortion clinics are about all over the world. Obviously, it's not. And so I won't be spending a lot of time on exceptions because, for one thing, I haven't got probably any more experience than most of you would have with regard to these. They're theoretical issues that most of us never ever really come into contact with in real life. To give you an example, here's a question that came in this week. What if a homosexual gets married to another guy, but after knowing Jesus, he becomes heterosexual and gets married with a woman? Would the marriage with the woman be illicit because of his previous marriage with the guy, or because the marriage with the guy wasn't valid before God in the first place? Would the marriage with that woman be valid? Now, there's a lot of exceptions in there, but I think the one that kind of overrides the rest of them is this exception of homosexuals suddenly becoming a heterosexual. There are probably a growing number of people today who just play around with various perversions to come up with something new, and so they experiment with gay sex, amongst other things. That's not really what I'm talking about in this situation. I acknowledge that there are people who genetically are born with some sexual problems programmed into their genes. Whether they're these people that have both sex organs, that type of thing. You can't argue and say, well, they chose that kind of a lifestyle. And so if a person has a natural attraction to someone of the same sex, then trying to force that person into a heterosexual marriage is, I believe, unfair to the wife and cruel, actually, to the husband, because you're trying to make something happen that really I don't think is going to happen. It makes far more sense if a person has an attraction to someone of the gays of the same sex, to consider a life of celibacy instead. And that kind of brings us to another question, because as soon as we mention celibacy, people just kind of freak out all over the place, like that's impossible, you know. You have to have sex. Everybody has to have sex, you know. But that's not a problem when you consider that the Bible says not one single word against masturbation. Now, let me just interject here that a number of things that will be discussed today will relate to some video or some article that we've produced elsewhere on this channel or on another channel. And so we'll have links to those things in the description when all of this is set up to run, you know, normally over the coming weeks. And one of those links will be to a live stream on masturbation, as well as a video on masturbation in relation to what God actually says or does not say about such a thing. When you accept that there are two legitimate expressions of sexual or ways of dealing with sexual tension, one of them being marriage and the other being masturbation, then celibacy is not so totally unthinkable as some people would believe. And to get us back to our original subject, neither is celibacy after a first marriage has fallen through an impossibility. It can be quite a workable option. Now, I'm going to go on to the next question, and the next question is getting us to think a little bit more about what is the reason that people get married. The question comes from Joanne. She says, do you really believe it is wrong to divorce if both parties have stopped loving each other? Don't you think God's grace would cover remarriage for the sake of love? God is compassionate and understanding of our needs. And needs is the operative word there. Are we talking about love, or are we talking about sex? See, there's a difference. They're not the same thing. People get married mostly because they need sex. You can choose to love people whether you marry them or not. You know, and love is what we need, and love is what we can have with or without sex. So we're talking about a couple who've decided that they don't love each other anymore. Well, how did that happen? You know, I think what they're saying is they're getting bored with sex. You know, they want to try something different, try another partner and see how that goes. You know, they may be having other problems as well, but love is an act of the will. You know, it's not something that just hits you from outside. I know that's the Hollywood picture you get, that people, I just fell in love. You know, how did that happen? That's not real love. Okay, that's your hormones playing tricks on you. And there's nothing wrong with people getting married and having a sexual relationship, and that can be an adjunct to a loving relationship between two people. But you don't need to dump one partner and take up with another partner in order to find or to show love. So I think the question is kind of missing that point as far as you know, dropping one marriage and starting another marriage, and that a God of compassion is going to think that's all right. Now, we have within our community, I'm going to get onto a bit of a longer question here. We have within our community people who are single and even have children. And we have found that they can get support. You know, what the single parent needs is love. What the children need is love. And this love can come from aunts and uncles who are in the community, of brothers and sisters in Christ. You know, to think that a couple has to have sex in order for love to be a part of their life is really missing the point. So here's a question from Michelle. Which of your communities have women and children? I want to learn more about how all that works. Are the kids homeschooled? Most of my friends have children, and perhaps the single women feel they cannot preach the gospel full-time because of their other obligations, meaning the children, I presume. I'm single with no kids, so I can pick up and leave with almost no notice. but I think I could be of more help to others in different life situations if I knew others who have dealt with these types of situations. Michelle, yes, we do have communities with children in them, and we have single moms in most of these communities that have children. And there are brothers and sisters who are single who can help the mothers, but ultimately we do believe that the mother has the final responsibility and the final say with regard to the children that she's raising. It's just that there is support that can come, and this can come in a divorce situation where children are involved as well, that their needs can be met without the parents necessarily having to go out and get another sex partner. That's not what the children need. What the children need is love and people who care about them. Now we have a question. Well, actually, what I need to do here, I think, is kind of go back and just look at this whole question of divorce and remarriage, and how it has led to so much confusion in church circles all over the place. So I have two questions I'm going to put together and then try to answer the two of them at the same time. No, wait, sorry. One question at this stage. There's two later on. Luis has sent in saying, how do you understand the passage in Matthew 19:9 that suggests that a second marriage is not considered adultery if the person divorced their spouse due to sexual immorality? Well, that's the verse that causes a lot of tension amongst Christians, because it has a phrase, and again, it's an exception. It says, except for fornication. The question is, does that phrase, except for fornication, apply to divorce, to remarriage, or to both? Now, ironically, Mark and Luke also quote Jesus as saying the same thing, but they leave the exception out. So in Luke 16:18, Jesus is quoted as saying, whosoever shall put away his wife and marry another committeth adultery against her. And if a woman shall put away her husband and be married to another, she committeth adultery. Actually, I was reading Mark 10:11-12, but it's basically the same thing in Luke 16:18. Whosoever putteth away his wife and marrieth another committeth adultery, and whosoever marrieth her that is put away from her husband committeth adultery. Now, I've repeated those three verses because I want to get it very clear what Jesus is talking about. The exception thing is even an exception in these verses. Matthew included it. Mark and Luke didn't think it was necessary. So let's go back now and look at the context in which this is spoken. We've got some Pharisees. They come to Jesus and they're saying, Moses said if we want to divorce our wife, we just put it in writing and give her a paper and be done with it. We can divorce her for anything we like. And Jesus says, well, that's not God's will. Moses may have said that, but it's not what God intends. And then he tells us what God expects. But who or what situation were the Pharisees suggesting? They were not talking about someone committing adultery. They were talking about somebody who was, quote, innocent. Okay, and that's the term that causes so much confusion in the churches when they take that exception rule. They say if the other party has been unfaithful, your wife's cheated on you, okay, you can toss her out and get yourself another wife, because you're innocent. You didn't cheat on the wife. That makes you innocent. Okay, like you never did anything wrong. Didn't even make a bad choice in choosing that wife. I don't see it that way, but let's go with that for a bit. Let's go with the innocent party, the party that did not commit adultery, is free to remarry. And let's go back to what the Pharisees were asking. Okay, is it all right to divorce somebody? Jesus says, well, if you divorce somebody, an innocent party, we're not talking about adultery. She's innocent, you're innocent. Okay? If you divorce her and she gets married, she's committing adultery, even though she never committed adultery herself. And if you get married, you're committing adultery, even though you never committed adultery before the divorce. Can you see how the exception rule cannot apply? If you take that out and read the sentence, read the command as appearing in Mark and in Luke, and even in Matthew, if you understand that exception rule only applies to getting divorced. And both sides, I mean, hardly anyone in the world today would say that unfaithfulness is not grounds for divorce. So everyone accepts that's an exception. You can get divorced, okay, if your spouse has been unfaithful to you. But you can't get remarried. You can get divorced, but you can't get remarried. And that's the part, of course, that everyone's having a problem with because, well, they want to have sex. Okay, and they just feel like they're entitled to that. Whereas the rule says, Jesus laid them down, is you just get one bite of the cherry, and that's it. This is not something you play at and you keep, learning new lessons and trying them out on new sex partners. So that's the problem people have with the divorce and remarriage passage, and questions and communication going on from that. Need to take that into consideration. That who is the innocent party, and why does Jesus say that even the innocent party is guilty of committing adultery if they remarry? Now we have a question from Mark, and this is another exceptional one. I think someone else asked a similar question as well. What if a woman is raped, becomes pregnant, and has the child? Is she technically married in the eyes of God because she had a child with a man? Well, as I said, because it's exceptional, I'm not much more experienced than the rest of you on this. I may think about these issues more than some of you, but I'm not really experienced with them. I'm not an expert or an authority. But it just seems common sense to me, and I would think most of you would feel the same way, that someone being raped is not married. They had no choice in the matter. They're a victim. Okay, so marriage then has to be more than just that you had sex with someone. It has to even be more than, and I'll talk a bit about this later, even more than just that a person became pregnant because of the rape exception. But how many of the real people filling churches today who are remarried divorcees were raped? It's an extremely rare situation that people will try to then use to justify all this kind of remarriage that's going on. Rolfie asks, and this is what we're kind of leading up to here. What exactly is marriage before God? Is it a signed paper that says so? Is it when two people have children? Is it when they have sex? Is it when they start to live together? Or is there something else we can use as a criteria to define when a couple is married? Okay, now we're not talking about exceptions. We're talking about real practical issues that are not easy, but do need to be dealt with. And I think a lot of us would have differing opinions with regard to all of these criteria for defining marriage. I would think probably the safest one to eliminate is that just having sex with someone is not necessarily marriage. If that results in pregnancy, then yes. That's one of the most universally and historically consistent definitions of marriage, is that when someone becomes pregnant, whether you felt committed or not, you are committed. You have a responsibility to raise that child. Now, again, the rape story is an extreme exception. But when there's a child involved, then it makes sense that the parents, like it or not, should stick together and raise that child. Until the sexual revolution of the 1960s came in, and it came in because birth control then became freely available to just about anybody. Until that time, the marriage licensing was taken very seriously. And so people just assumed, well, if you really want to be committed to a relationship, then you go down to the courthouse or wherever and you get yourself a piece of paper that says publicly, we're committed to marriage. Now, obviously, those pieces of paper differ from country to country, and they're not ordained by God. These are very political things, and they serve a purpose within society in order to settle disagreements over the responsibility for children, over inheritance rights and partners dividing assets if they break up, things like that. It serves a purpose within society, but it also does serve a purpose for us as Christians, because I think the primary word with regard to marriage is commitment. And a lot of this stuff has got no necessarily Christian basis, of having a big wedding cake and spending a lot of money and dressing up in tuxedos and all that goes with the wedding, throwing rice or confetti on people, smashing glasses, doing dances. It makes the whole event stick in the minds of the people who participated in it, and in particular the couple. In other words, it's letting the whole world know we are committed to living together for the rest of our lives. And so a marriage ceremony, a piece of paper, makes it a lot harder for someone to sort of back out and say, oh, well, no, I was just pretending, But because of the sexual revolution, where people don't have to worry about getting pregnant, they became a lot less inclined to bother with a piece of paper. And now the new, I would say the new criteria of commitment to an exclusive relationship, which is what marriage is about, is when you move in with somebody and you start living together. So that's probably a pretty good indication. Somebody who's just, had a one-night fling with someone, it's wrong, it's sinful, it's fornication, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're married to that person. I hope that helps to give a little bit of clarification. Each of you are going to have to really work these issues out for yourself. I'm not God. I'm only trying to share from my own experience. Okay, another question. This one comes from Claire. She says, what are the benefits of celibacy? And how does the community encourage someone to remain celibate? Now, this is the one I want to combine with a second question. And they're quite different, but I'm going to show a relationship between the two. The second question comes from Juan. If polygamy is not forbidden in the Bible, why is it considered adultery to have a second marriage when the first spouse is in agreement with not continuing the first marriage? So we've got two extremes here. We've got celibacy and we've got polygamy. Okay, and I suppose most people today are in between the two, and they're just going in, okay, monogamy, maybe it's serial monogamy, this wife this year and another one next year, but it's kind of not polygamy as far as the average person is concerned. Well, I'll include a link to an article that I wrote a number of years ago called Moral Development in the Area of Sex. And it considers how in the early days of the Bible, the very first commandment God gave to mankind was to have sex. Are you aware of that? In the Garden of Eden, God said to Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. The world needed population. And so it was for the sake of populating the earth, people needed to have sex. And so the early leaders in Judaism, or the Hebrew religion anyway, most of them were polygamists. They had several wives. It was just kind of the done thing. If you had enough money to be able to feed them all, well then, start populating the earth. Get as many kids as you can. Over time, of course, that's changed. And when we get into the New Testament, things settle back. There is a kind of subtle reference to polygamy in something Paul wrote when he was talking about leaders in the church. And he said the leaders must have one wife. Now, this was not a requirement. They had to be married. I think the word that's left out but implied there is that a leader must have only one wife. Okay, now we've gone from the leaders being polygamists to a rule which says the leaders should not be polygamists. There may be some in the congregation who were, because they were just coming out of that. But Paul was saying, if you're going to be a leader, just one wife. And then Paul goes on further to say, and Jesus also says, it's even better to have no wife. And there's some question about whether Paul, in fact, had a wife or not. We know Peter did. but it seems that quite a few of the early apostles did not have wives. They were celibate. So that's the other extreme. And while the world today has the church world has discarded polygamy of the traditional sort in favor of, like we say, serial polygamy, divorcing and remarrying every now and then, they have also rejected celibacy and just kind of teach that it's the ultimate purpose for everyone on this planet to eventually get married and have, pretty little wife and pretty little kids and a pretty little house. But that was not the way Jesus taught it, and it's not the way Paul taught it. So the question, let me just check this question again about celibacy. It was, what are the benefits of celibacy, and how does the community encourage it? Well, we encourage it through making the benefits clear to members of the community. And the primary benefit of celibacy is that you're free. The singles of the world recognize that. They may be sleeping around, but they still say, well, I'm free. I don't have a responsibility to stay with any of these women that I'm having sex with. We would just simply say, stop having sex with these women and stay free to work for God. So you can move quickly. You don't have the responsibility of trying to sort everything out so that you and your wife can be together wherever you go. That is a benefit, and particularly if the couple then start having kids, then it becomes even harder for them to go into all the world and preach the gospel. As Michelle pointed out with the mothers who have children, I think I forgot to comment in answer to Michelle's question that the mothers in our community, the single mothers in particular, have a preaching opportunity and responsibility every day with their own children. That is part of our ministry and our outreach. And those children, at least some of them, will grow up to be, Christian leaders within our own movement, hopefully. So preaching to the children is a part of it, but also in our communities, the children and the parents go out in the streets, and we witness on the streets as well. And so that becomes a whole part of their life, 24/7. And part of a question that Michelle asked, which I didn't include, is, well, how do we get our children to grow spiritually? We'll put them in a community where the whole community is full-time, 24/7 for God, and they're going to just grow very, very naturally. They're going to see all the benefits of such a lifestyle that comes simply from obeying Jesus. And that just makes for some pretty powerful Christians in our children. I would put many of our children up against theologians, and I think the theologian would run and hide, because they know and they've experienced what it means to have faith in Jesus. Okay, so that was about celibacy, which we encourage. We don't require that. The Bible says in the last day there'll be people who forbid marriage, and we don't forbid marriage. Nor do we forbid people having children, even though we encourage birth control so that the couple can stay as mobile as possible for God. But one's question was asking about what's wrong with remarriage if polygamy was allowed in the Old Testament. As I said, well, polygamy is not necessarily allowed now. We're trying to find out what God is doing over the whole course of history. A problem with people trying to say that every single word of the Bible is equal is that we get trapped back there in an unfulfilled law. Until that law is fulfilled in Christ, we're going to run into all kinds of problems. And so we will run into problems if we start promoting polygamy, even though it's there in the Old Testament. Christ is talking about a much higher standard as far as sexual issues are concerned. So the second marriage is, I guess, consistent with not accepting polygamy. It's just what Christ said. If you're going to get married, you only get one. Now, next question. What have we got here? Philip has asked, if a couple is in a second marriage for one of the partners, and they have children, and they are happy together, do they still have to separate? Wouldn't that hurt the children? I probably covered this a little bit in Joanne's question, but I'll make it a little bit more clear here with regard to the children. Now think about this seriously. Do children need parents who are having sex? That's not what they need, is it? And yet parents will stay together in a sexual relationship saying, we're doing it for the kids. No, you're doing it for yourself. Staying together may be for the kids, but a sexual relationship is for yourself. So what I'm trying to say here is you could actually stay together and not have sex. Is that unthinkable? Now, within our community, that's possible. And even if it results in a divorce or a separation because one party won't go along with that, the other party still can have the support and practical assistance of other brothers and sisters within that community for the benefit of the kids. And we have seen that our kids, I think they're pretty special. I suppose a lot of parents think that, but I just feel like we homeschool our kids, as Michelle asked. I think that we're able to give them a better education. Homeschooling is not a case of trying to run away from a school system. We believe in education, but I believe the education is best when it's coming from teachers who have a personal commitment and love to the child they're teaching. And that's what happens in homeschooling if everything's going as it should. The laws are different in different countries, and so we're constantly trying to find the best way forward. We've had a few situations where we've more or less had to put some of our kids into system schools, but we try to keep that to a minimum and to give them as much support as we can because we know there's a lot of temptation that comes in the school system. Sorry, I kind of got off of Juan's question and into Michelle's there, but I hope the information is helpful to both of you. Now, Philip, okay, it was Philip who just read. Paco, we have a question here from Paco. Aren't the rules about sex in the Bible outdated? What is wrong with adults having consensual sex now that we have birth control and ways to protect ourselves from STDs? Well, yeah, there have been some major changes. As I mentioned earlier, birth control certainly changed the whole concept of shotgun marriages, for example, where the guy got the girl pregnant, and so the in-laws turn up with a shotgun to make sure he marries her and does the right thing, takes care of her and takes care of his child. That's his responsibility. When you do away with that, people then assumed, you see, that they could just have as much sex as they like as long as it was protected. And of course, these days, they don't even bother with birth control. Sometimes they just have an abortion. And I would say that's pretty strong evidence that something is not right in the idea of, we're just going to have consensual sex, meaningful relationships that, maybe only last for one night or a week or a month. I think God is still down on that because he's looking at more than STDs. He's looking at more than unwanted pregnancies. God's looking for our development as spiritual beings. Now let's change the situation a little bit to another form of pleasure that we humans have, and that's food. Suppose somebody, it just wants to eat and eat and eat, but they don't want to gain weight because they know that's unhealthy. And so they vomit every time they finish filling their stomach up, and then they fill it up again and they vomit, and they fill it up again and they vomit. What do we think about such a person? Don't we think, something not quite right? There's more to life than eating, And it's the same way as far as sex is concerned. Our society has just become so obsessed with it. And I would think that part of it is not because sex is so great. I think they're having bad sex, really. And it's because sex is so bad, they keep looking for something else that might fulfill the need. And I would have to say, if you really have to have a sexual relationship with another person, you can't really beat marriage. And the blessing that comes from knowing that somebody has committed their life to you exclusively, and you are committed to that person exclusively. Yeah, I know it's for better or for worse, and the worst is going to come, but that's when love really flourishes. That's when we see what love is really all about in a marriage relationship. And just sleeping around, okay, you can stop the infections and you may prevent pregnancy,